if people could just admit people as they pop up. I have changed the settings in Teams, but that doesn't seem to have worked. I have given automatic sort of access for people coming in, and the recording started, so I should start to say something interesting. So brilliant. Thank you so much for coming, and it's great to see so many people on the call. This is a really sort of well, I guess it's a summary of my journey over the last 6 months, where I've just tried to deep dive into all the evidence behind organisational change and try to put a new framework and a new body of knowledge behind organisational change. Clearly, it's not, it's not perfect. It's not the end. It's more of a start of something that hopefully is a bit more robust and evidence-based than what we have at the moment. And intellectually, it's been amazingly, incredibly demanding. I've had to get my head around all sorts of things, and I'm sure there are people on this call who know and understand a lot more than I do about what I'm going to present on. So please bring all your comments and wisdom into this. And just to reiterate that, I'm not an academic. I'm not. What I say, I'm not expecting anybody to take it as a truth. This is more of a starting point for you, maybe to go away and investigate areas that that you maybe think are gaps in your knowledge, or to help me fill my gaps in my knowledge from areas that better than I do. So if I do stumble on some of this stuff, please help me back up with your knowledge. Okay, so this is, as I said, a sequence of sessions that I've been running, and I started off by sort of questioning what are we going to do with organisational change, sort of going forward, because I've written a lot about the myths around organisational change and some of the problems with some of the theories that we take for granted in change management, and I sort of suggested maybe the future is more evidence-based, and then I took a step backwards, went through the history, which was incredibly enlightening for me, particularly as I haven't done a master's or a PhD in organisational change. My background is more been sort of positive psychology and organisational strategy type stuff, although I have been practicing organisational change. And then I looked into more of the sort of scientific mindset. So what do we mean by, or what can adopting a more evidence-based mindset bring to organisational change? And then you get all sorts of challenges, which I will go through during the session as well, and gets a bit sort of philosophical. Then we just did a fun session on myth busting, and I talked about the neuroscience, because there's a lot of chatter around neuroscience. I'm not sure how well that went down, but anyway, watch the video on that. So here we are, kind of at the end of the journey, and to support this and my case for sorry, is my camera okay? Because it just took a little drop there. That's okay. Brilliant. Thanks, Steve. Yeah, so what I'm doing now, and sort of in parallel, and will carry on doing, is just deep diving into each of the constructs or evidence-based elements that I think are important for organisations to be able to change. So that's just a series of things that I'm running now. I ran one on resilience last week, and I've got one coming up, I think, on organisational support, I think, or is it relationships? So in this session, I'm just going to go through, why another model? Why do we need more stuff around this? We've got ADCAR, we've got COSA, we've got numerous other things, Shen's model, whatever it is. Why do we need something else? So hopefully I'll present a convincing case and I haven't wasted my time inventing something completely different. And then I'm just going to go through how we sort of, sorry, these aren't numbered correctly, but how we're going to disentangle organisational change, and then potentially what the capabilities are that we should be looking at, and then take you through a sort of practical example and how I use the tool in practice that I've sort of developed. So, the first bit is just starting off right at the beginning, I guess, which is, how do we qualify what is knowledge and what isn't knowledge, and what's in and what's out. And I guess, it starts off with, how do we judge whether something is knowledge, which is the sort of ontology of it. I'm not going to worry about, I'm not going to discuss definitions, but, you know, is our knowledge built on sort of objective, you know, sort of science and data analysis, or is it subjective? Is it about how we feel and all the rest of it? And that relates to the sort of epistemology that we adopt. Are we being positivist? You know, are we saying that, you know, everything is, that the empirical reality is the only thing that matters and we go around measuring stuff? Or are we more sort of anti-positivist, and we're sort of saying, well, actually, we can't be that scientific, or take that approach with organisational change because it's a social science, and we can't apply physical sciences to natural science problems, and we've got this issue of feedback, so we interpret the reality as we go, so there's no objectivity and all that sort of stuff. And then whatever we agree there then determines the lens or the process by which we then gather knowledge or test our knowledge. And then that kind of determines the methods that we use. You know, do we sit down and talk to people about their feelings, which might be a more sort of anti-positivist view, and we're sort of in the moment and thinking about the sort of feedback loops that are going on in that conversation, or do we just use a survey and do, you know, a sort of a high level number crunching exercise to find out how people feel in the organisation? And yeah, we'll come on to, you know, this idea that things have to be separate, that that there's a dualism here, that it's either one or the other. And what I've discovered through my reading, coming from quite a positivist position, is actually we don't have to be one or the other. And I'm trying to embed that in the model, and we'll talk about that as well. And it'd be great to get your contributions. And I know some of you have quite sort of strong ideas around how we should be interpreting change. So I just sort of wondering where we start. You know, why do we need to be better? And not going through all my myth busting stuff and all the problems with the validity around some of the models that we use, and try and use something a bit more independent and objective. And I found this thing by Pettigrew in the early 2000s, who was saying, you know, what do we need to improve on in terms of organisational change and challenges for future research. This is a sort of call out to academics, I guess, and practitioners, I think. And one of them, I guess, is around you know, context and complexity. So the models that we're using, are they really taking into account the complex nature of human interactions? Are we really taking into account the context in which change is taking place? And then the other problem with models, you know, linear models, is that they're not really taking into account the sort of time and history. So whenever we go into an organisation as practitioners, there's always a history, isn't there? There are always stories, and that is a good predictor of how people potentially are going to respond to future changes, how changes went on in the past. And do our models really take that into account, or do we just assume that we start from a clean sheet? And there's also this more positivist view that we should be creating a connection, a causal relationship, or being confident in our causal claims, that when we say, if we do X, then Y is going to happen. That's kind of our job as practitioners, in a way, is to go in, run interventions and say, well, we're going to try and improve psychological safety or trusting leadership, whatever it is. So what's the relationship between change and performance? This idea, of how do we measure readiness, and how fast do we push the change according to levels of readiness, and can we measure readiness? And then this division between scholars and practitioners. So I'm just going to dive a little bit deeper into this, and some of you, this is kind of repetitive from me, I guess, because this is me on one slide, and why I'm not a big fan of M-step change models. You know, and this is about context and complexity, that the models that we use aren't based on solid evidence. They're potentially out of date. They don't take into account context and complexity. They make these extraordinary extrapolations, like brain state change or the change curve or whatever it is, taking theories from outside of organisational change and applying them to organisational change, even if they're not relevant to their own field. Hello? Sorry, yeah, if you could just turn, if people would just turn their mics to mute, that'd be great. And yeah, they're fairly negative as well. I found, you know, sorry, the brains hate change thing again, and creating a sense of urgency. And, you know, Connor and people and Cotter talk about people being naturally complacent and they need a good sort of push in terms of change. And this becomes a sort of self-fulfilling prophecy that change becomes quite a negative experience for people because we have these sort of preconceptions of what it is, and they tend to be top-down, project-based. They're sort of closed systems. So because they're kind of very mechanical, they don't take into account context and the complexity. And we know that complex systems are open, and they're open to their external environment, which is one of the themes of today. Anyway, so that's my sort of my gripe, I guess, with those kind of models. And I think this is where sort of Pettigrew and co are coming from. Then I found this really, I mean, this looks complicated, but hopefully I can explain it and you can sort of try and digest it. And it took me a lot of reading to understand just this matrix. But this is a great paper if you want to, if you'd like to read it and really get to grips with the different approaches that are out there for organizational change. And, you know, the approach one is those kind of linear type models, where they're saying there's a clear causality. You know, we add car, we do the A first, we do the D, then we do the K and the A and the R, and we don't debate whether desire comes before awareness or the ordering. We just kind of get on with it and we assume that there is. And the problem with those types of models is they're based on, you know, these false assumptions which we talked about. I'm kind of a fan of approach one in the sense that I think at the end of the day we have to come up with some kind of causality, but you know, it doesn't have to be that sort of brutal, and we'll talk about that on the next slide. And then this approach two is this, so this is called the variance method, where it's saying there are variables in change or in an organization and we can go away and control them. The second approach is sort of process narrative. So this is sort of saying, well, actually, things aren't fixed in time, that we impact on events that happen in organizations. So there's a constant sort of feedback loop in terms of our interventions, and the best way to understand that is through narratives. And actually we're constantly moving through time, and so actually it's a process of emergence, and we're moving through cycles of change, and that's a really interesting approach, and I guess it's gained more favor over the last sort of 20 years maybe, and is a pushback on the sort of positivist view of how we should conduct organizational change. And then this approach three is taking this this process narrative further in terms of saying, well, sense making is about, you know, in a complex system, is about how we bring things into reality, how we create meaning through change, and what change means, and different perspectives of change, and trying to understand that, and that it's emergent and it can take place at different speeds at different times. And then there's this approach four, which is thinking about the complexity. So thinking about the system as a whole, we're interested in the variables, but we're not just interested in moving from A to B. We're interested in how C affects B, how A affects C, how D affects Y. We're interested in the interrelationships in complex systems. And I think, you know, to be successful in organizational change, we've got to mix these approaches together. And that paper was written in, I think, 2005. And then there's this one, which this paper was written in 2020, and I've just sort of tried to summarize it in this slide, which is sort of saying, well, you can think of those variance models like these linear models, and we're moving through. So we start off with a linear level approaches, and this is, yeah, the pure variance approach, where Adkar, Cotter, Shen's model, they're all here. They're all sort of saying, well, there's a hierarchy and a process, and And then we kind of realized, well, actually, these things are probably happening in parallel in an organization. So I've always wondered, we go unfreeze, change, refreeze, but then what happens after refreeze? Do we unfreeze again, or do we change and so because change isn't bookended, so how these systems work in parallel, and what happens after we finished Kotter's 8 steps. So then you get into this looping idea, and it's I find it very interesting that Adkar, Prozai have adopted. Oh, sorry, I shouldn't have done that. Adkar have adopted this sort of circular thing, and I think I'm not really sure what it is, or how it helps, but just the visual for me that there's kind of maybe a loop rather than the linear Adkar is interesting. And Kotter has also changed his 8 steps to what he calls the big opportunity, which he's just made them into 8 circles now in potentially no particular order, or maybe you can jump around them. And I remember reading somebody writing about organizational change that said, yeah, Kotter's model's fine, it's just got to do all 8 things all at the same time. So I think Kotter's come round to that now and republished this. So they're starting to understand this idea of change as being a sort of recursive process. So this is the ongoing cycles and adaptation of change. And we can move the recursive process into then understanding what the interrelationships are between these different stages of change. And I think the best models for that are Burke and Litwin's change model. And you can see, I'm not going to go through it all, but you can see all the feedback loops that are in here. And I think this is potentially one of the best models that are out there. And then you've got, I'm a big fan of Joe Hatch's model, where she takes Shen's model, and you'll probably see Shen's model here, assumptions, values, and then artifacts, and she adds in artifacts or behaviors within organizations become symbolic. So when organizations go out and force people to come back into work and leaders announce that becomes very symbolic, and potentially has a huge impact on change. So but she puts it in a loop, and she divides it into this subjective, objective, which we'll talk about later. So so I thought that was that's interesting. So and then you move on to this sort of conjunctive view, which is a sort of a difficult word to describe how to make connections between different elements of human experience, and breaking down analytical sort of distinctions. So bringing in different bodies of knowledge. So bringing in, say, biology into, or complex thinking, or neuroscience and the mechanics of neuroscience and complex systems into our thinking about how humans move and how humans interact and change. And so I thought these 2 ends here, weak process, strong process, just nice ways to summarize. If you think about a film, when you create a film, you start off with snapshots, don't you, of scenes of what you want to film, and you sort of plot those out in a linear way. And then as those sort of images speed up and you start to get into the editing, you form a moving picture of what's happening, in an organization. So I think that's just a nice way, I think, to maybe try and visualize the kind of maturity that we need organizational change to go through in order to get a bit more like a film and less like a sort of a comic book. So there's a lot there. Any questions on that? Because I don't know if I explained that very well. I'm not sure how well I understand it, but it'd be good to get any views on that. Are you all on mute? Are you put yourselves on mute? Can you get yourselves off mute? Or have I put you on mute? Steve?
No, we can get ourselves off mute.
Brilliant. All right. Any thoughts? Because I can keep rabbiting on, but I thought we'd have a pause.
Alex, maybe just a note to the Adkar model. The cycle you have in the middle, this is a little bit the the developed approach in ATCA, yeah, that they are putting now a cycle around, like in kind of agile or iterative approach, yeah, thinking about that. And in the middle is still ATCA. And you're right, it always seems as very linear. I personally use it also a little bit to say, of course, awareness is important before you really can get the what's in it for me, etc. But you always have to think about where you are and maybe step back, like I said, in a little bit iterative way. Yeah, this is my interpretation.
Yeah, and I think that iterative process hasn't been there in ADCAR. My understanding when I did my course in 2010 hasn't been
Exactly,
there.
exactly,
And certainly,
exactly.
Steve,
You're
I know,
right.
I don't know whether, Steve, this is what you're going to talk about, but I know you've got an
Yeah.
issue with the whole dialogue thing. So where's dialogue in ADCAR, which we know is a circular recursive process, but you're on mute, Steve, sorry.
That wasn't going to be it, but since you mentioned it, I mean, my issue with ADCAR is, and for others who weren't part of our conversation, Alex, when I did my certification, I spent 3 days with a really good ADCAR consultant, and we had a conversation in the middle of the course, whereas I was challenging him on the, I guess, on some of the central assumptions about ADCAR and the nature of change. And he said to me at one point, well, you're right, 70% of this depends on dialogue. But the word dialogue was not mentioned in 300 slides. So I think there's some really interesting stuff in ADCAR, but it has a very global North perspective. It's very American, it's very Western European. What I was actually going to say was, and it's interesting when we talk about this, what's lurking behind some of these constructs, and ADCAR is a lovely example, is the thingification of change. We try and turn change into an object to manage our anxiety, both individually and collectively. And the reality is, you know, when we look at something like ADCAR, we look at Berkeley and all these nice boxes, people are having huge anxiety, and there's emotion, and there's rage, and there's fear, and there's all this mess going on. And many of these models attempt to codify and sanitize the mess. So the ones that interest me are the ones that actually don't deny the mess, but they're actually not that many.
Yeah, although Bert, this model does look like a bit of a
well, the Bert does, although again, it's of a moment in time, and the interesting thing about that one is it was designed pre the digital age, and it doesn't, you know, its presumption is of an in and an out, and it has no notion of, if you like, the permeable boundaries that exist. It's customer focused rather than having the notion of a user. Once you come to the notion of a user, Berg-Lippmann in its original form collapses.
Yeah, brilliant. Thank you, Steve. Words of wisdom, and that was on the previous slide as well. Is that the variables type model is you're looking at things rather than looking at a process, so a continuous sort of process. If you've ever watched the film Donnie Darko, when that blob comes out of his belly and he's just following this sort of path, I think that's a lovely way. You know, it's not anyway. That's how I conceptualize it, and sort of touching the blob as well, which we will talk about. And another thing that I experienced as well, writing on LinkedIn and discussing this with people, is that people got really sort of into or hung up on notions of reductionism and holism, and this comes back to that previous model that if you believe in the variance type thing and you think of things as things rather than sort of ongoing events, then you are accused of being reductionist. And then there's the sort of holism where people say, well, we should be looking at the system as a whole, which is extremely difficult and very complicated. And, you know, academia sort of struggles with that. And as you said, Steve, as well, you know, I guess the positivist view is quite sanitized view of reality. And I think there's this sort of paradox, isn't there, between how much do we simplify stuff and maybe ignore some of the complexity of iterative events that take place versus trying to actually get to what's going on, which is highly complex, and maybe organizations just don't have the time resources to. So there's always that balance. And I found this quote from Yanir Bar-Yam, who is a big complexity theorist, who's just saying, you know, reductionism is vilified by people who are, you know, complexity theorists, and actually the whole idea of holism or complexity theory is a reduction in itself. And in fact, everything in our brain is a reduction. We can't think in non-reductive terms. We have to simplify things, because otherwise we are reality and we live in reality, and we can't distinguish ourselves from reality. So I'll come on to that. But you know, he sort of suggests that the difference there is between the sort of reductionist and non-reductionist approaches is really just focusing on what are the interrelationships between the variables, what are the interrelationships between what's going on, and how much complexity do we want to delve in sort of that realm. So I thought, you know, in order to understand a complex system, we have to kind of at some stage reduce it to its component parts, but at the same time we have to view it as a whole system. So it's around those interactions that are so important, that link reduction and holism, if that makes any sense. Another area as well that I found really useful in terms of trying to understand change was getting into the real nitty-gritty of the mechanics of complex systems. So what are there across all complex systems, complex adaptive systems, that are common, whether it's an amoeba, you know, swimming around, whether it's a human, whether it's an organization, they're all complex systems. What do they have in common? And we're all fighting entropy, you know, we're all fighting, well, it's not a very simplified view of entropy, you know, is sort of you know, we decay over time, and we're trying to avoid that, and you know, we need information in order to not to decay, and you know, all the so there are ideas around entropy, and there are also ideas around what's called Bayesian updating, which is, you know, we have a set of prior beliefs which then bias our future beliefs. So the mental models we have in our mind are good predictors of how we're going to act in the future. Even if you present new evidence, we're not very good at sort of updating our evidence and challenging our views, and then you get all these sort of cognitive biases occurring and stuff. So I found Bayesian updating a very interesting idea of how we can help people adapt and change. This idea, we'll talk about free energy and active inference and Markov blankets as well, but I thought that they were useful concepts. Markov blankets is how we demark ourselves from each other, from organizations. If we were all the same, then we would just be one thing, and there would be nothing, or there would just be one thing. So we have to be different. So complex systems have to have diversity within them, and so we're dealing with, in organizations, we're dealing with diversity. So that made me another way of conceptualizing change as well. But we'll talk through these things and touch on some of this stuff. I do talk about this stuff in detail in my other session on complex systems. Then there is this sort of link between change and performance. So why aren't we very good or very confident in going into organizations and saying, well, if we do X, you know, Y is going to happen? There's all the contextual issues and all the rest of it. But at a more fundamental level, or more from a sort of positive point of view, we're usually not very clear on what we mean. We're certainly not very clear, I don't think, in my experience of working in organizations, we're not very clear on the problem we're trying to solve. So people just have a sort of scattergun approach. They pick out a fad, growth mindset, psychological safety, whatever it is, and they just apply it without really thinking about what the consequences are or understanding the problem. So that whole sort of definition thing, what are we really trying to do? And a lot of definitions around organizational change are just tautologies. They're just sort of like, you know, people change is the people side of change. You know, I mean, it's just not a helpful way of defining what change is. Or they say change is the people side of change. Well, change is only ever about people, because, you know, an IT solution can't change without human interaction. So not helpful. Scope, you know, this extrapolation issue, which I talked about. Steve, you touched on it as well. You know, that these models are sort of conceived in the pre-digital age, and whether they're relevant to the digital age. So are they out of date, and various extrapolations that are not justified. And then relationships. So when academics build ideas, you know, they're usually built on a body of knowledge of, you know, oh, well, Gowder thought of something in 1960, and this is a refined version of his idea of sort of social exchange or whatever it might be, that actually we exchange favors in organizations, and that's the way that relationships are built. And if you don't return a favor to me, then I think that's unfair and I behave in a certain way, so that that you can trace. And that's why I found the history of organizational change so interesting, because you can trace things back. But you get something like Kotter and it just pops out of nowhere, pretty much. It's based on Lewin's model, or it's based on something that was thought up by a consultant in the early 80s. But it really, there's no evidence or body of knowledge behind it. And similarly, I don't see that with ADKAR either. The ADKAR book starts off with a case study of pineapple growers in South America. It doesn't quote, it only makes one quote to a theory around motivation, which isn't used that much anyway, motivation theory. So there's this whole, where did all this stuff come from? And then that creates sort of incoherence, because we don't have a definition, we're not really sure of the scope or the relevance, and we're not really sure how these ideas relate to anything else in psychology or organizational development or social sciences or anything. And then we get what's called construct invalidity, I guess, in this sense. So that's why we can't see the correlations between what we're doing and what's happening, because we don't have a body of knowledge to support what we're doing. And I think this is a real problem in change, because if I was a doctor and I was prescribing a medicine, we go into organizations and prescribe medicines. If I kill somebody, I could potentially be sued. And I'm not saying that that's what should happen to practitioners, but we're going into organizations and we're potentially having a huge impact in what we're doing. And if someone comes up and says, well, why do you think that's going to work? If you can't say, well, actually, it's built on a body of knowledge, 30 years, and I can give you lots of examples of where it's worked, and there's been lots of studies and blah, 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 blah. If you can't do that, I think we're walking on thin ice. And I think that's why we need a bit of a change in change. So here's just some examples of loose thinking around, or definitions that all seem to mean the same thing to me: organizational change, organizational development, HR, strategic HR management, change management. All these definitions pretty much read the same to me, and it's about adapting what we're trying to do in OD or change or whatever you want to call it. We're trying to adapt human capability to meet internal and external ambitions of an organization, or challenges, trying to respond to challenges. And I think this conceptualization as well fits nicely with the model and some of the other models that we'll look at. This is another one around change capability, change readiness, organizational flexibility, organizational buffering. They're all pretty much saying the same thing. So for me, it's no wonder that people get their knickers in a bit of a twist around, I'm talking about organizational buffering and it's better than organizational capability. It's not. For me, it's all the same stuff. And there's lots of ambiguity around what we mean by change readiness. Do we mean individual readiness? Do we mean organizational level readiness? Do we mean structural readiness? And this is why I've called it change capability, the practice of adapting human capability to meet internal and external ambitions. So we're talking about, do we have the capability to change? And there are models out there that sort of say that they do this. OCAI and DOCS. I don't know if anybody's familiar with these, but there's Denison's Organizational Cultural Strategy and Organizational Cultural Assessment Instruments is the OCAI. They're based on, rather than Shen's model, which is trying to explain what culture is, these models are trying to say, well, organizations need to dial up certain traits in order to become adaptive and or create certain cultures. And actually, these two models weren't developed for that at all. They were developed around organizational effectiveness. And we're not really sure what they measure, because again, they don't seem to be based on robust constructs that potentially, if you're an OD practitioner or about OD stuff, or it's not there. When you read this stuff, you're looking for psychological safety, or you're looking for trust in leadership, or you're looking for goal setting or whatever, and actually in this one it does say defines goals and objectives. Okay, so they tick that box. But something like organisational learning is a very broad area, very difficult to pin down. So unsurprisingly, these models don't have good test retest. So you can go to an organisation, one day they'll look like this maybe, and another day they'll look like something else. So they're not very good predictors of change capability or culture. And when I posted up on LinkedIn, I spent so much time there, I can't believe I forgot. I asked the question, do you think change readiness is important? 81% of people said it was. There was some no's there, and I can't remember what the no's were. Probably disillusionment with the models that are kind of out there. And just to touch on scholars and practitioners, I'm not going to go through this slide, very complicated, not very detailed, sorry, not complicated. But this is when I talk about a body of evidence. You can see all this stuff that's been developed through the years to understand what we mean by self-efficacy. What do we mean by, autonomy? What do we mean by intrinsic motivation? There's tons of research, tons of stuff out there, which is so important for change. And yet Connor, Cotter, the SCARF model includes bits of self-determination theory, but they all generally ignore this great body of evidence that's out there that we could be using. And it's interesting, when I went out to practitioners and said, what do you think are the most important elements of organizational change, what you said was the same as what academics were saying, which is we've got to be clear on our goals, we've got to get good supervisory supports, we've got to have a powerful coalition, we've got to have people advocating the change, we've got to develop trust in leadership, clear vision, fair change process, all that sort of good stuff. So there is, for me, there's some clear alignment on what organizations should be doing, and yet you go to something like ADCAR and it probably won't talk at all about goal setting or the importance of supervisory support. Maybe it does talk about supervisory support. So how's it going? That was 40 minutes for the first section. Am I talking too much? Is it all making sense, all fitting together? Brilliant. I'm getting that. Steve, thank you. Sorry.
I've got I guess an observation or reflection on you said about the different definitions of the fields, that they're broadly the same, the way they define change, which I'm not sure that's the case. So I'm going to email you something, because I couldn't post it in here. A really nice, it's a shot of somebody posted on LinkedIn from an article or book on the differences between change management and org development. And I think there are some significant and fundamental philosophical differences between the two fields. And that's the thought that occurred to me when you were talking about this, which is, if we run the risk of treating something like a science that is more philosophical than that. So the whole world of management and leadership is under 100 years old, and we've got far more to learn from several centuries of creativity and philosophy than we do from that, arguably. We like to think we know this stuff and it's all, got it all sorted, but we clearly haven't, because we'd all be buying the same book.
Yeah. No, absolutely. And there are questions about whether you can ever treat organizational development or change as a sort of a science anyway. I guess what I'm trying to convey, I guess, is that there is, even if we've only been around for 50 years or 30 years, there's still thinking that we should be tapping into and not inventing stuff just out of the blue. That's kind of my main contention. I guess you could argue that actually that whole body of knowledge is based on a scientific approach to organizational development change. So you could argue, well, it's not valid in that sense. Anyway, that's probably a separate debate. But yeah, if you could send that over, Steve, that'd be great, because you've helped me in the past in some of this stuff. So yeah, I just wanted to, to talk about some of these dichotomies that form the basis of the model that I'm trying to develop, which is, we again, this sort of dualism. We sort of say, is it about autonomy or is it structure? In organisational change, how much autonomy do we give people to make their own sort of choices and feel self-determined, and how much structure do we offer? So do we go into an organisation and say, right, these are the behaviours that you have to adopt, and very rigid about the structure? Or do we give people high-level principles and say, well, you make up what kind of works on the coalface? And I find, a nice analogy here, I think, is a football field. The structure is the field. It's what the players do. Most organisations have that. We know what the field is in which we are operating, and we have goalposts and all the rest of it. But how you play the game is highly autonomous. And I think that's just a nice way of visualising what I mean here, and whether how we get the balance right, how rigid you want those rules to be. In order to affect change. And I guess that depends on what philosophical viewpoint you're coming from. If you think you can affect behavior, then maybe you want to be more structured. If you think behavior is more emergent and you're in that sort of process thinking, then maybe you want to give people more autonomy. Or maybe in certain areas like finance, you actually need to be highly structured because there are certain routines they need to follow. And in other areas, say marketing, where it's a bit more creative, maybe it's more autonomy. So anyway, I think it's a interesting dichotomy. And I think it helps us with things like diversity and inclusion, for instance. So here is a nice model to sort of say, right, how do we get to an inclusive culture where we've got to allow people to feel a sense of belonging? We've got to give them structure. We've got to give them sort of rules and values and behaviors about how we act. What's appropriate behavior within the organization. But on the other hand, we want people to feel that they are unique and appreciated, and that they are kind of separate and different from everybody else. So there's a natural tension between separation and cohesion. And I'll talk about that a bit more in terms of the mechanics of complex systems. And then there is, another dichotomy, or paradox, the sort of being and doing. So what's inside of me? What am I reflecting on? What am I thinking about? What's my relationship with the outside world? Is sort of cognitive. I'm sort of imagining and I'm envisaging a different future, and that's sort of around beliefs, and it's kind of subjective. And then there's the doing bit, which is how we see people express themselves in the world, which is behavioral, and it's objective. I can see what that person is doing, and so you get this sort of paradox of reflection and performing, or being and doing, and this is actually one of the kind of ways in which neuroscientists are conceiving how we become conscious, or how we're conscious. So if you look at Anil Seth's book, Being You, for example, he talks a lot about active inference. So he talks about us predicting our world. So we are sort of an isolated being, as it were, in terms of our skin divides us from the rest of the world, and we make predictions about the way the world is, and then we sort of observe what happens when we intervene in the world. And when there is a divergence between what we think is going to happen, what actually happens, the evidence from the outside world, we get a discrepancy. And if in terms of change management, this is that sort of that sort of nexus, I guess, of change, where people have to put in some form of energy to be able to either correct their beliefs about the world, the way the world is, or they leave the organisation, and create their own world, or live in their own world, or don't comply to the behaviour and do things kind of in a different way. So there are these sensory states where I'm kind of being, and I'm trying to understand the world that I'm in, and there are these active states where I'm affecting the world, which is my autonomy. I'm affecting the world and doing things, and then observing what the reaction is. And for me, I think this is a nice conceptualization of change and the way that maybe change should be done, in that, you know, we have a sort of a blob, which is the outside world, which we don't know what it is, what's going to happen in the organization. We run an intervention, we see what happens, we observe, we get feedback, we talk to people, we measure, etc. And then we form a new belief about what that organization is, and then we go again, maybe with another intervention, and we keep on round in that learning loop. And that's very much that process orientated approach to change, rather than a sort of a linear, this is the process that we follow regardless of the feedback that we're getting from the system, as it were. And this is the idea of Markov blankets, the fact that we are individuals, but we are nested in lots of others. So your cells in your body are nested in you. You are nested in a group of people, or a relationship with somebody else, and then a group of people, and within an organization, and within an external environment. The way that we understand these worlds is through these two processes of acting and sensing, which is the sort of being, which is the sensing, and the doing, which is the acting. And very loosely, got to throw in a bit of neuroscience. Maybe this is the way that our brain kind of can work as well, that we call this sort of default network, being, thinking, sensing sort of networks. And when we're not doing stuff, our brain is in kind of a resting state or default state, but it's actually doing a lot of work. And then there's this sort of executive control network, which is what we do when we're thinking and acting. So maybe our brain is geared to doing this, the sort of sensing and acting process. But I would highly recommend Anil Seth's book, who can explain this stuff a lot better than I can. That's quite, I think that's quite complicated. Maybe, hopefully I've explained it in a non-complicated way, but that's the way neuroscience is going, and that's the way that thinking about how our consciousness is formed is going. And so I think any model of change has we've got to get that in there somehow, how we create our reality to understand how people respond to change. And then, yeah, I talked about these dualisms. You know, we talk about art versus science, and, you know, they're not very helpful. Potentially, you know, we have to be creative in science, and creativity is seen as being an artistic thing. You know, we have to be logical in art, and we have to be sort of, you know, but logic is seen as being a domain of science. So there aren't these sort of dualities potentially, or we need to avoid thinking about dualities if we're going to get into this more sort of emergent state of how change happens in organizations, that we can't be defining things as simply as that there are these big overlaps between autonomy and structure, and being and doing. So that's me trying to disentangle all of this. I may have got it even more tangled up, but just to sort of just to summarize a little bit more on this, I guess, you know, this is, I think, the importance of moving from these linear type models. You've got Shen's model here, which I mentioned earlier, to Jo Hatch's cultural dynamics model, where she takes Shen's model and she puts it into this circular view. And here she talks about moving from the objective activity, which is a behavior, an action, to objective reflexivity. So that turns into an image that we have in our mind, to sort of a meaning where we're subjectively trying to take in what that action, the impact that our action has had on the outside world. We're trying to understand that from a this sort of subjective internal reflecting on that, and then that starts to form our identity, how we interpret the world. And I think it's interesting that Hatch's cultural dynamics model, this recursive model, fits very well with the neuroscience and the mechanics of complex systems, in terms of acting and sensing the world that we live in, and that by acting we create our sort of reality through sensing and sort of sense making, whatever. And this is all within that process of Bayesian updating, that we're constantly updating our beliefs about the world, how the world is, by touching it and seeing how it reacts to our actions, and how it reacts to that. And I think this is also important in terms of understanding beliefs and behaviours. That some people say, well, we should be changing beliefs, and other people say we should be focusing on behaviours. But in fact, well, the research seems to suggest that behaviours potentially precede beliefs, that we go out and act on the world in a certain way, and then we use that information to then form our beliefs, rather than maybe we also have preconceived ideas and we try and push those onto our world and see how they work. So what that active inference process is doing, and what Hatch's model is doing as well, is actually saying that behaviours and beliefs are part of the same process. It's a circular, recursive process of constantly updating beliefs, testing those beliefs, looking at what behaviours or what the system tells us about our beliefs, and then updating them. So anyway, I find that area kind of interesting, and I think the model has to reflect that. And if anybody's familiar with Ken Wilber's AQAL, all quadrants, all levels model, have a read. He's completely out there in terms of philosophy, and he's not sort of recognised by any institutions or whatever. I kind of like him for that, and he's come up with this model, which again reflects Joe Hatch's model. I don't know whether they sort of spoke to each other, where you have the sort of the formation of me, my identity, I, through these beliefs and values. What I am out there, the it's, the me, my sort of behaviours, and then the us, which is how the organisation, or how we work within systems, so how we see other people's behaviours and how they affect ours, and then the we, which is the sort of internal, intersubjective. So how do we understand our relationships with each other, and the stories and the language that we tell each other. And you can see this model repeated. This is Lips, I can never say her surname, Burisma. Her meaning making model divides again that sort of being and doing with a internal and external. If you've seen Paul Gibbons's Science of Organisational Change, he claims that he came up with this before anybody else did. I don't know if he's on the call, but anyway. But yeah, he formalises this integral model of change. I'm not sure how keen he is on it, now, but I think it's very useful because it reflects, that latest thinking in neuroscience and mechanics of complex systems, and that sort of active inference that we were talking about. If you look at Bert Litwin's change model as well, I think you can classify these areas. He talks about mission, strategy, structure, which is the inter-objective. We can see those things, and it's how we relate to the organisation, because we can see those structures and all the rest of it. And he talks about the objective, which are individual behaviours, individual, he calls them skills and tasks, and then the intersubjective piece, which is the culture, so how we form relationships, and how policies and procedures work in reality, and then the subjective view, which is about our values and our beliefs, and he talks about individual needs and values. So you can see this idea, I think, in lots of different models that are out there. So I've put these, I've used that quadrant, being, doing, unique and belonging. I've used that idea, which I think has got a sort of robust body of knowledge behind it. But then I started to think, well, what are well-known constructs or evidence-based constructs that create that inter-subjective view, or and I just call it learning organisation, but that how do we, which is ultimately kind of the culture, as it were. And things like psychological safety, organisational fairness, support, organisational support from your manager, and the relationships that we have in organisations are all got a lot of evidence behind them that they help with organisational change. So these are the constructs that we should be focusing on in terms of creating that that we, or that subjective view. And then the subjective view, which is just how I'm thinking and feeling, and my beliefs, you know, what's going on in my head, as it were. Lots of research around resilience, efficacy, autonomy. I wasn't sure how to label adaptability, but there's something around a positive attitude to change. So some people have, you know, sort of predisposed to be more positive potentially about change. So there are, yeah, those constructs. And then the behavioural stuff, which is, you know, how I'm seen from the outside, the sort of me bit, which is, you know, am I goal directed? What's the quality of the job? Is, you know, does the job skill set, or what I'm being asked to do, fit with my capabilities? How we hold each other to account, and the sort of dialogue piece, how we give feedback, how we interact with each other. And then there's the inter-objective, which is the organisation, what you see from the organisation. So what's that organisation's purpose? How the performance systems run in order to, you know, reward and recognise people who are, you know. And then there's the sort of development piece, and obviously the leadership as well. Sorry, you can probably hear my dog going mad in the background. Sorry about that. And this is just a summary of this, and just sort of describing what all these different parts of the model do. And so I hope that this model sort of takes the sort of positivist view that there are constructs that can be tested and are applicable to organisational change, while at the same time understanding that there are these feedback loops between being and doing, and uniqueness and belonging. So it tries to combine those variance models with the process models, and I'll talk about that in a bit more depth. So what we can then do is we can start saying, right, how do people express their identity, you know, from their internal state into the external state? How do we get this relationship between autonomy and structure? And this is through that process of sensing and acting. How we get from the I to the we. How do we find out who we are through change? And also the sort of the me. Sorry, I've got this the wrong way around, haven't I? No, that's right. I and we, and me and us. How my behaviours then determine what the overall behaviours are of the organisation through this sort of sensing and acting. So how do we create our identity and change? Sorry, I didn't complete this slide, but that was the relationship between autonomy and structure, and then this one's the relationship between beliefs and behaviours. So I express who I am through my behaviours, but at the same time I'm then sensing how my behaviours are received in the sort of the outside of me, and then I reform my beliefs based on that, and then I act again. So again, there's this sort of Bayesian updating loop of how I update my beliefs based on my behaviours. So there are these natural feedback loops within the model. And I guess then the question is, okay, so how do we understand those feedback loops? So I put these together. I'm just going to skim through these because you can read these in your own time, but this is just more detailed description of what all of those different 16 capabilities are, and there are the slides sort of describing what they are. And if you're an OD person, you probably know all this stuff anyway. So I just wanted to get into the relationship piece now. So how do we understand what the feedback loops are between those different constructs? And actually that's not as difficult as it sounds, because we know there's lots of research that's been done into, say, what are the preconditions for psychological safety, for example, and what are the likely outcomes if we create an environment of psychological safety. So let's just talk about that in a bit more detail. So this is how the model works, and this is a sort of dynamic system which you can play with, and I'll actually move on to so what looks complex. All these components are potentially related to one another, and that's not a surprise, because ultimately all these sort of constructs sort of can be distilled down into some basic sort of theories built in psychology years and years ago. So it's not surprising that they are kind of related, but it's the strength of relationship. You remember earlier we were talking about what's important in terms of the distinction between or how reductionism and holism work together. So here we've got holism, and it's very complicated, and we're trying to pick our way through it. Here we've got kind of a reduction of that. So then we're saying, okay, well, let's just look at fairness. Fairness, which is organisational justice, which is about, are the processes we're following just, are the outcomes just, is a key driver of, or has a strong correlation with relationships. So if we want positive relationships in organisations, we've got to treat each other fairly. Fairly obvious. That's what the research says. That's what this model says. We're not really sure what the direction is. You can delve into the research to find out which way that causality goes. And some of it, we don't know which way the causality goes. And so we just have to use that. We can experiment in the organisation to find out. And here again, you can see fairness is related to dialogue. And we know that one of the constructs or one of the things that we're measuring in fairness is employee voice, for example. So do I have voice in the way that the decision's being made on the change? So we can start to see some of these relationships. We can start to unpick them. And then the question comes, well, how do we prioritize? What do we focus on? And in this sort of upgraded version of the model, what I've included here is we allow employees to choose what they think is important for the organisation, and we look at the interrelationship, and we look at what the score is. So here, for example, I've taken resilience as an example. So resilience is green. So the organisation seems to have the attributes of being able to be resilient. It is voted as not being that important. It's quite a small one by staff, by employees, and we can see the correlation that it has with goal direction and development and all the rest of it. What's interesting here is the relationship that it has with purpose, for example. So we know that if we want people to bounce back, a definition of resilience, they want to know what they're bouncing back for, i.e. a sense of purpose, a sense of direction, a sense of belonging, all the rest of it. So what this does for organizations is it sort of triangulates. If we know that people think it's important, we're not very good at it, and we know that actually it's related to lots of other things that we want to be good at, maybe we should start focusing on, resilience, for example, because it drives lots of other things. We know staff are going to, feel that they want to feel more resilient, and we know that we've got to be good at it to change. And then if you think about all these different capabilities sort of being cells in our body, and they form to do different functions. So we have our reproductive system, we have our respiratory system, whatever it is. We can start to build models around. So for instance, employee well-being, if we want to focus on employee well-being coming out of COVID or whatever it is, then we know that resilience, adaptability, autonomy, and efficacy are all things that give people the belief around their well-being, that they can cope with life or whatever. So that's the kind of interventions that you would focus on, or you'd focus on dialing up those areas. Don't know why that's in there twice. Similarly, if you're looking at the sort of motivation system, so what are the key components? If we feel that we want to motivate people for change, then we know we want to build resilience, because at some point they're potentially going to fall over. We want them to feel that they can jump back and get back. We need dialogue, so we need supportive sort of conversations with people, and we know that feedback is a great motivator. We know that the feeling of self-confidence or efficacy, and we know that people need a clear goal. So we can start to dial up certain areas. And I think what's interesting here as well is that if we're starting off change, maybe we need to get people motivated about it, so we focus on these areas. But then as we move through the change, we might think actually we need to dial up different areas. So if you want to sustain change, then maybe we focus on supportive relationships and psychological safety, because that keeps the dialogue going around the change. So you might want to dial up different capabilities depending on where you are in your change process. So this is that sort of time and history part of what Pettigrew was saying. And we can also then start to build models when we do our leadership training or management training. We can start to build models of, okay, so we want to build trust. So we found that a certain area has got a low trust score. We can delve into the evidence, and there's loads of evidence on trust in leadership. There's a meta-analytic review here, which is sort of saying, well, all the predictors of trust are, fair decision making, holding people to account, so not having psychological breaches, i.e. being felt that you're being let down by the organisation, organisational support, etc. These all support trust, and we know if we get trust right, then that will improve people's perceptions of support from their managers. It'll improve relationships, which helps retention issues, and people will believe in the information that's sent out to them. So then we can start to build, and we can do this as training and talk to managers about, okay, which bits of this do we need to dial up to help you build trust within your team for change. Sorry, I'm talking a lot here to okay, you're all still there, that's good. So just pulling all this together now, we've got I thought this was a nice piece of work. So we've got this sort of cross section, so we're measuring a particular point in time, this snapshot. So remember when we were talking about the variance model, it's a snapshot, it's just a frame of where we are in our change journey. But what we're trying to do is create a film. So we need some kind of linearity, some kind of way of joining up all of those frames and sequencing them. And there was this nice review of all these popular change models and sort of trying to group them and ground them in some evidence, sort of retrospectively, as it were. And what Denise Rousseau and Stout and de Kramer found, they sort of come up with these sort of 10. They shortened it now to about 5, I think. But they're sort of saying, look, these are kind of the things that we should be doing in sequence, which is sort of understanding the facts or the nature of the problem that we're trying to solve, the organisation that we're working in. So doing some sort of diagnostic to understand where we are, which is stage 2, and then come up with a compelling vision for, okay, what we're going to do. We're going to dial up trust, we're going to dial up goal setting, whatever it is, some kind of vision of what we're doing. We have to create that capability within leaders. We need some sort of interventions. Let's work with the networks of people who support what we're doing. This is why we started measuring employee that sort of ranking of what employees thought was what the organisation needs to get better at, because that helps then create these social networks of people who've sort of said, yeah, we need to be more trustworthy. Okay, so here's an intervention around trustworthiness. So yeah, so there's this sort of storyline that we can follow, and we can also go and say, well, if we want to shift people from their beliefs to sort of behaviours and try and help them create meaningful interpretations of what we're doing, then these are the kind of behaviors that we need to adopt as managers to take people through thinking about whether they're going to change, all the way through to sort of maintaining that. And this is, what I came up with from reading various stuff on this, that we've got to start off with the reflecting, inquiring, affirming, listening, which I think is where that sort of, I don't know, authentic leadership question mark over that, and empathetic leadership kind of comes from. We need to start off with listening and understanding people's issues. Then we need to sort of go through some sort of acceptance of kind of where they are, reframing where they are, to maybe try and help align it to where the organisation needs them to go, sharing experiences, and then moving on to sort of that honouring, experimenting, building confidence. Yeah, I know what I'm doing. I know what's expected of me. I can experiment with behaviours. There's a safe space for doing that, and then recognising, appreciating people for the change. So we there are mechanisms within the research that show us how to move people through those different through those sort of different loops, as it were. And then you end up with this sort of overall process, which is you know, you're taking these snapshots in time, and then you're pulsing through time according to the things that you want to get better at, or you feel you need to get better at, and that's measuring individual level of change and the organizational level of change, because the organizational level is the sort of external and the internal is the individual is the internal view. So we then move through this, and then we create this sort of this motion picture of what's going on in the organization and how we adapt that complex system to meet those external needs. And it creates a sort of agility, because we can dial up and dial down capabilities according to the challenges that we faced. So that's it in theory. And here's just some principles. So I just thought, and this is kind of what it looks like in reality. So this is just a random bunch of data. So this is not data from an organization, and this is based on the short version of the model, which I'm testing. There's a longer version, which is 80 questions. This is 40, I think. But basically, you sort of end up with a score on each of these different areas. This doesn't show the weighting of the importance that staff put on these. I haven't developed the model to that level yet. That's done outside of the model. And it sort of gives you know, total scores and areas, you know, that need to be that are high performing recommended areas, and then gives a sort of overview of each of the individual competencies. Now, I'm not saying by any means that this is a true view of the organization, or that this data means anything other than just a diagnostic to start a conversation around, oh, we seem to be scoring low in efficacy, because this model uses robust scales and questions to measure efficacy. So it's saying, okay, we're not doing very well. What are we not doing very well in? We're not doing very well in fairness, for instance. So let's have a discussion about that. Maybe the model's wrong. When we bring this into conversation and into that dialogue, maybe it's not. Maybe people, you know, hopefully the questions are robust. But then we can start to break down fairness. We can start to have a discussion around, is it the process? Is it the outcomes that are unfair? Is it the fact that you don't feel that you have voice in the process? So this is not there to answer questions. It's more there to ask questions, I guess. It's more of the sort of coaching view than the mentoring view, if that makes sense. So yeah, this is all the data output that you can get, and then ultimately I'm going to attach all the learning and top tips around it. So if you want to improve in certain areas, here's some top tips based on evidence and etc. So that's it, and that's kind of where I'm at developing it all, and that's the sort of whole rationale behind it. So yeah, I'll open the floor. Have I gone mad? Have I just completely gone over the top with this, or does it kind of make sense? And you sort of think, actually, yeah, that might be useful to do an initial diagnostic to understand where the hell we are with all this stuff. What do you think? This is the acid test now. Do I just get lots of blank stares?
Well, in the absence of anybody else diving in, Alex, I'll happily give my immediate reflections.
Yes, please.
So, bear in mind, I've not looked at the details, so I'm kind of going with it washing over me, in a sense, at the moment. So, what I notice is, at one level, it's quite overwhelming because there's so much there. But I'm also thinking that if I was client side, I'd be getting this in segments and in bits. So there's a whole architecture here. There's a whole scaffold, and as a client, I wouldn't be getting it all in one go. No. The different bits you've drawn together, I can see why you've pulled them together. I guess my overarching thought is, I've got several. Most models and the need of the model are wonderfully intoxicating to senior leaders because it helps them manage their anxiety. But you're still left with the anxiety. So one of my questions I have is, where within this do you poke your client and not let them off the hook of the fact that they're going to have to wrestle with their own individual and collective shadows. And they can't just abdicate responsibility for the mess, because you rightly said it's messy.
Yeah.
So the very elegance of the model might also be part of its shadow, which is it could over sanitize some of the mess. The other thought I've got, and I'd have more after, is if I have a look at the deck, if you send it out, I'm happy to have a look. I was having a conversation with somebody last week, Martin Saville from Maven. I don't really know Martin, Alex. We were talking about the fact that there's a lot of talk about reflective practice in organisations and leadership, and certainly within OD and change practice. My experience is that most organisations that talk about reflective practice actually don't want to do it, because to do proper reflective practice means you have to look at your own shit, bluntly. And lots of consultants, and I'd say this from having spent a lot of time amongst the OD community, we talk about reflective practice, but not that many of us, again, are prepared to go where we really need to. So there's a lot of talk, but we're understandably not that comfortable when push comes to shove to really, really dig in and fertile in our undergrowth. And I think you would, unless I missed it, Alex, you talked about reflection at points. I think you were talking about the importance of reflective practice. You may not have used that language, but that was my interpretation. So I think this stands or falls still on the same things, in my experience of change, which is, are people up for getting uncomfortable? Are they up for the reflective practice it involves? And is there any kind of understanding of the difference between change practice and consulting or change management? So I do a lot of supervision of internal